The Bains were a dysfunctional family with several secrets kept behind closed doors, when suddenly, on a cold winter's morning, all but one would be murdered. A myriad of clues would lead officers to two primary suspects, but with sabotage, legal complications, and even a house fire adding confusion to this case, no one could agree on who exactly killed the Bains family, and opinions on this matter would divide the nation. Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and today we're exploring the case of the Bains Family Massacre. Now, today we're travelling to a country rarely covered here on Coffeehouse Crime, and we're travelling further back in time than usual. It was in New Zealand in 1994 that the Bain family would meet their untimely end. But how and why? By all means, this story is tragic, but what makes this one unique are the details which leave many questions on who exactly killed the Bain family. I'll let you decide for yourself. And by the way, I post solved, unsolved and strange cases here weekly, so if you're interested, please consider subscribing to Coffeehouse Crime. And so, with that said, let's begin today's video. Go grab yourself a coffee. This is the case of the Bains Family Massacre. I've already given away our destination for today's video. Welcome to New Zealand, folks. Found in the southwest Pacific Ocean, New Zealand is one of the world's most isolated island countries. But alongside this isolation comes a very special and unique environment. New Zealand is a land of great contrast and diversity. Active volcanoes emerge out from its rugged landscape, where winding caves and gorgeous glacier lakes carve deep into its terrain. This, of course, is overlooked by the country's staggering population of 26 million sheep, a number far greater than its human population of only 5.1 million. And, fun fact, but New Zealand is also home to the longest name in the world. Now, it wouldn't be Coffeehouse Crime without at least trying to get the name right. Named after a hill in Maori, Taumata Whakatangi Hanga Kuwowo Tamatia Turipu Kakapiki Mawanga Horonoko Pukai Whanuake Tanatahu can be found towards the south of New Zealand's Northern Island. Now, one more time, that's Tamataka Whakatangi Hanga Kuwowo Tamatia Turipu Kakapiki Mawanga Horonoko Pukai Whanuake Tanatahu. Maybe wrong in a few places, but I'd say that's pretty good. Moving on, we begin today's case on the day that David Cullen Bain was born, and that's March the 27th, 1972. David was the first child of his parents, Robin Bain and Margaret Cullen, and the two married 3 years prior to his birth in 1969. When David was only 2 years old, Robin found the opportunity to become a missionary teacher in Papua New Guinea. And so, he along with his wife and 2-year-old son uprooted their lives and moved 3,000 miles northwest. While here, the Bain family household grew from 3 to 6. David became the eldest of 4 siblings. His sisters Arawa and Laniette were 3 and 4 years younger respectively, and his younger brother Stephen trailed 8 years behind him. Now, it's time to add strangeness to the mix here, but while in Papua New Guinea, Margaret became interested in New Age spiritualism. She believed in the channeling of spirits, and thought that her family needed to be protected from satanic influences. Unfortunately, Robin's dream of being a missionary teacher waned thin over the years. And eventually, the family returned to New Zealand in 1988, 14 years after moving to New Guinea. The family settled into a large house located in Anderson's Bay of Dunedin, which is located towards the southern coast of New Zealand's southern island. 3 years after resettling, and in 1991, Robin became the principal teacher of a small school. And although this sounded promising, life back at home wasn't going so well. By 1994, Robin's and Margaret's relationship had almost entirely deteriorated. The two argued daily, and, quite frankly, Margaret couldn't stand being around the man. And disturbingly, she had even made comments about killing him. The family were also extremely messy. The large house had become derelict over the years, and although it was falling apart and in dire need of repair, Robin was not there much to help out. During the weekday, he would live and sleep in a caravan near the school. And over the weekends, although he was home, he would live in another caravan parked in the property's garden. The Bain family were dysfunctional at best. The house was a total mess, and keeping it clean was not a priority. In fact, those visiting would describe it as a pigsty, and many unpleasant smells lingered in the air. Safe to say, Robin's and Margaret's marriage was on the rocks too. And although he maintained some form of relationship with his children, some of them were very questionable. There were rumours that Robin was abusing his youngest daughter Laniette for several years. This will be brought up again later. As for David, he often had a strained relationship with his father. He was very close with his mother Margaret, and the two of them often held grievances against Robin. In the year of 1994, and at the age of 22, David was a music student. He was still in education and aspired to be an opera singer. Whether you think he had the talent to become internationally recognised, I'll let you decide. Now, despite the unsettling environment, all 4 children were in work or in education. Arawa was training to become a teacher, Stephen was in high school, and Leniette had a part-time job. David's story was different. He had found it difficult to assimilate back into education, and had even dropped out of university a couple of years prior, before seeking unemployment benefits. He would eventually return to university to study classical music, and as a part-time job he worked as a newspaper boy in the early mornings. Now again, there were many issues within the family, and where a mother and father should hold the closest bond, for the Bain family that was quite the opposite. And in fact, by the year 1994, Margaret had grown to believe that Robin was being possessed by the devil. This was proven in her diary, where she frequently spoke about her husband being host to a demon named Belle. Whether this was true or not, I'll leave that up to you to decide, but Margaret would even perform exorcisms on Robin to remove this demon from him. Needless to say, Robin was miserable in his life, being forced to live outside in a camper van and essentially exorcised by his wife whenever he returned home. The man was not happy. Robin's mental health had diminished drastically over the years. He neglected his hygiene, was severely depressed, and seemed to act like a robot according to his colleagues. The 4 children were split over their favourite parent too, causing further tension in an already debilitated family. And by June of that year, problems had reached a breaking point. But nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, expected what would come next. Monday the 20th of June, 1994. Ahead of the rest of the world, New Zealand was waking up to a fresh new week. The sun had barely peeked over the horizon when suddenly, at 7:09 AM, an emergency phone operator was met with a very frantic David Bain.
They're all dead. What's the matter? They're all dead. I came home and they're all dead.
Who's all dead?
My family, they're all dead. Hurry up.
And your last name?
Bain.
Bain. Okay, we're on our way. Okay, Mr. Bain?
Hurry up.
Yeah, we'll be there very shortly.
David had called 911 to inform authorities that his entire family had been shot. He found his mother Margaret and his sisters Arawa and Leniette dead in their beds. The youngest of his siblings, 14-year-old Stephen, had also been found dead in his room after putting up a fight. And as for his father, Robin was found in the lounge of the house with a bullet wound to his head. David's rifle was found on the floor next to his father, and on the computer, a typed out message saying, "Sorry, you are the only one who deserves to stay," was left behind. Police officers, who arrived just several minutes later, were left with a truly harrowing scene. All 5 members of the family were confirmed to be dead. And to add to the home's usual disarray, were the grisly remnants of a chaotic family massacre. This was the beginning of a very long investigation, and although the morning had already presented enough shock and despair, nobody knew how much this case would eventually divide the nation. You see, from the very moment that officers arrived, there were 2 potential main suspects, Robin and David. The only thing is, one of them was now dead. The crime scene was set up in a way to make investigating officers believe that Robin was the killer. He had been found in the lounge with the rifle in arm's reach of his body, and on the computer nearby, a so-called final letter suggested that he had killed his family. But beyond the tragic tale, this is where it gets very interesting. Due to the length of the rifle and the angle at which the bullet entered Robin's head, it was considered almost impossible that he had taken his own life. And to add to this, the direction in which his blood had left his wound suggested that Robin's head had been moved shortly after his death. Shifting their sights over to their second main suspect, officers began to grow suspicious of David. If his father had killed the rest of his family, then why had David been spared? To add to this, David's story didn't quite add up. He had told officers that he completed his newspaper round between 6 and 6:42 that morning. And in fact, a neighbour would even confirm to officers that he saw David entering the property at around 6:40 am. But David wouldn't call for help until 7:09 am, an entire 24 minutes after returning home. He later exclaimed that during this time, he simply zoned out and didn't know what to do. David also couldn't explain the fresh injuries to his forehead or his knees, and the gun found next to Robin actually belonged to David. To make things worse, David even admitted that he was the only one who knew where the key to unlocking the gun could be found. With all of this suspicion growing around David, officers were very quick to detain him, and only 4 days after the Bain family massacre, he was arrested and charged with their murders. Digital forensics played a vital role in this case. It turns out that the computer in which the note had been typed had been switched on at 6:44 am. Now, according to external witnesses, and even David's recollection of events, he had returned home at approximately 6:42 am. So, this means that the computer had been switched on after he returned home. Over the following days, fresh evidence which suggested his father was innocent came to light. For example, no one else's blood was found on him, including on his socks and shoes worn that day. To add to this, Robin's fingerprints were not found on David's rifle. And think about it. If the last thing he did was shoot himself, this would have been almost impossible to avoid. No gunpowder traces were found on his hands either. Despite all of this shocking evidence building up, on July the 7th, only 17 days after they had been murdered, relatives of the Bains family made the order to have the house burned down. They were worried that teenagers would break into the property and recklessly burn it down. So, in response, and with the approval of David Bain, they decided to burn the house down themselves. Which really doesn't make a lot of sense.
Someone would set it alight in anger, relatives asked the fire service to do the job properly. Within minutes, the old wooden house was engulfed in flames. I'm standing more than 100 metres away from the fire, yet I can still feel the intense heat of the flames. The house was consumed by towering flames for more than an hour. The fire could be seen over most of the city. It burned 17 days after Arawa, Laniet and Stephen Cullen Bain were killed, along with parents Robin and Margaret. The legality of the fire has been questioned by one law expert who doubts that the legal loose ends, such as who owned the house, have been tied up. But a trustee told 3 National News that the only surviving member of the Bain family and the man charged with the 5 murders, David Cullen Bain, agreed to the house being razed. He had told them he never wanted to see the house again.
With the house now entirely burned to the ground, investigators were only able to work with evidence that they already had. Now, I have to say, I find it both strange and stupid for the house to be burned down so quickly. To quote an officer working on the case, "There's a lot of work to be done, and as we all know, if you rush work, you will muck it up. So it's better to proceed at a reasonable pace." How the family received permission to burn down a crime scene so fast, or even why, is anyone's guess. Nevertheless, in May of 1995, almost 1 year after the Bains family massacre, David's trial would finally commence. Prosecutors did well to reconstruct David's timeline. They argued that at 5 am on that fateful morning, David had awoken to the usual sound of his alarm. After getting dressed, he slipped on a pair of white opera gloves, took his rifle and ammunition from the wardrobe, and unlocked the trigger lock using the spare key. He then systematically shot his mother, his 2 sisters, and finally his brother. But while fighting violently with Stephen, David lost a lens from his glasses and sustained several injuries. Throughout his actions, a lot of blood made its way onto David's clothes. He put these clothes in the washing machine, started it, showered, and then changed into a fresh set of clean clothes. These actions would leave bloody marks all over the laundry room and the bathroom. David then went on his usual paper route at 5:45 am, as if nothing had happened. And after returning at 6:42 am, he then went upstairs, switched on the computer at 6:44 am, typed in a message, and then waited for his father to enter the property. Robin usually entered the house from his caravan to pray at 7 am, and unfortunately today was no different. David hid behind a curtain in the lounge waiting for his father to kneel nearby, and when the time was optimal, he shot his father from a very close range. David then rearranged the scene to make it seem like Robin had taken his own life, and then called 111 to report the killings, pretending to be distraught. This, of course, would be during the time he had apparently zoned out. But David's story was, of course, entirely different to this sequence of events. He told the court that he got up at the usual time, got ready for his newspaper route, and then left the property with his dog. Once he arrived back home at around 6:42 AM, he then went to his room, took off his shoes, and moved downstairs to the bathroom to wash his hands. David claimed that although he put his clothes in the washing machine, he denied that there was any blood on them. Heading back upstairs to his bedroom, he turned the light on and noticed bullets and the rifle's trigger lock on the floor. Frantically searching the house, he found his mother, sisters, and brother all dead in their bedrooms. His father was also found to be dead in the lounge. And of course, David claims that he then zoned out for 20 minutes before calling emergency services. David's defense team proposed that Robin was the one to kill his family, before turning on the computer, typing a message to leave behind, and then taking his own life. However, several parts to David's story didn't fully make sense. For example, he even admitted that he was the only one who knew where the key to the rifle was. To add to this was the time the computer had been switched on, the injuries David couldn't explain, and the 20 minutes he had zoned out. The prosecution argued that David's motive was financial. Apparently he wanted to gain their inheritance, and his parents had put a large sum of money away for a new house. David Bain was eventually found guilty on all 5 charges of murder, and was therefore sentenced to life in prison, eligible for parole after 16 years. Now, you would expect this story to end here, right? A family massacre. David Bain was the obvious suspect, and he is now sentenced to life in prison. Case closed, book shut. You would be forgiven for thinking so, but that is not at all how it turned out. Over the months, and then years, David Bain's case had brought in a lot of attention from a lot of people. News of the Bain family massacre had spread like wildfire throughout the nation, and public opinions on who was to blame varied greatly. One of those interested in the case was former rugby player and celebrity Joe Karam. Playing for the All Blacks rugby team from 1972 to 1975, he had long retired from the industry, and in his more laid-back years, he had grown an interest in David Bain's case. Joe wholeheartedly believed that David was innocent, and he very quickly became vocal after David's sentencing. Over the following years, he visited David more than 200 times in prison, and he would even write 4 books on the matter. Joe's research and continuous pressure on the justice system was so great that it eventually resulted in an appeal to the Privy Council. This appeal began in May of 2007, which was 12 years after David's imprisonment. This appeal was both monumental and cataclysmic. The Privy Council's investigation found that there had been a substantial miscarriage of justice against David, and they therefore ordered his convictions to be quashed with a new trial scheduled. The Privy Council, which is actually located in London, argued there was considerable doubt that David would have been convicted if the evidence found post-trial had been put to the jury, and most of this evidence came in the form of what the jury was not told. For example, one witness, Dean Cottle, was a friend of Laniette's. According to Dean, Laniette had told him about her incestuous relationship with her father, and on the weekend of the massacre, she had travelled home to inform the rest of the family about the horrible affair. This testimony would have presented a possible motive for Robin, but the judge in the initial trial concluded that Dean's evidence was hearsay and deemed him to be an unreliable witness, this therefore suppressing his story from the jury. As time went by, other serious allegations came to light. This included the fact that Robin had published brutal and sadistic stories written by his pupils in the school newsletter, one of them even involving the story of a family massacre. There's a 46-page document which highlights all of the first trial's wrongdoings. It's honestly too much to cover in this video, but I can see why the first trial may have seemed unfair. None of this information was available to the jury in 1995, and so David's defense was not able to properly point the finger of blame towards Robin. David was therefore granted bail and allowed to remain out of prison while he waited for retrial. He would even move in with Joe for 3 months before moving over to Auckland. I can imagine that this feeling of freedom felt like a very temporary luxury, as David knew he would eventually have to face the court once again. And 2 years later, in March of 2009, the retrial began. David and all of those involved would have to relive this nightmare all over again. He of course pleaded not guilty to his 5 charges of murder, and again, his defense team argued that Robin was the killer before turning the gun on himself. This time, they had a lot more evidence to suggest why Robin may have killed his wife, son, and 2 daughters. They could now describe how and why Robin was morbidly depressed, how he had exhibited disturbing behaviour to colleagues and friends, and what exactly the aggravating factor to his actions could be. This, of course, was centred around Laniet's secret, which apparently she was now ready to expose to the rest of the family. David's retrial would last a total of 3 months, but despite this, it took the jury less than 1 day to come back with their verdict.
Bain, do you find the accused guilty or not guilty? Not guilty.
They unanimously found David Bain not guilty on all 5 charges of murder. After 13 years behind bars and a further 2 years legally considered as a suspect, David Bain was let go.
You may leave the dock, Mr. Bain.
And ever since his retrial, David has remained free. You know, there are many details to this case which still make me believe that David is the actual killer. I mean, there is a lot to think about here. His bloody fingerprints were found on his rifle. He couldn't explain his fresh injuries. Stephen's blood was found on his washed clothes, and he couldn't explain his actions while zoning out. And to add to this, it is still widely accepted that due to the angle of Robin's wound, it would have been impossible for him to take his own life. So, if not him, then who? And then there's the fact that he gave permission to burn the house down, which, if you ask me, that speaks volumes. David's girlfriend at the time also testified that shortly before the murders, he had a premonition that something horrible was going to happen, which seems rather convenient. But on the other hand, there are several aspects which firmly suggest that Robin may have been the murderer. He was very unhappy with his life, and if Laniet's plans were true, he would have been panicking. Several shell casings were also found in his caravan, and the disturbing stories revealed by his colleagues paint a very unhinged man. This case is extremely polarizing, and honestly, I'd love to hear what you think about this case. Do you think that David was the murderer, or do you think it was Robin? This case held some extraordinary financial sacrifices. The taxpayer spent over $7 million, with the retrial alone costing over $4 million, thus making it the most expensive trial in New Zealand's history. Joe Karam would personally lose over $500,000 through his efforts. David also sought compensation for being wrongfully imprisoned, but due to this case becoming so high profile, New Zealand's Justice Minister appointed overseas judges to review the application. The review came back to advise that David should be compensated for his losses. But due to these reviews taking so long, they were returned to the Justice Minister after he had retired, and the new minister disagreed with the former minister's conditions. 6 long years and much bureaucratic waffle later, David was eventually compensated for his apparently wrongful imprisonment. In the year 2016, he was awarded $925,000 to settle the matter. And in the meantime, while all of this was going on, he had found work as an engineer, fell in love, married and had a child with his new wife, and legally changed his name. It is rumoured that the family have now moved to Australia. There are of course no remains to the Bain family household, which was burned down in 1994. It has since been re-landscaped and refurbished into a 3-bedroom property. And over the decades, this story, along with all physical elements related to it, have faded out of existence. And so it goes. Thank you so much for watching another video today by Coffeehouse Crime. If you found this video interesting or you learned something new today, then please remember to like the video and subscribe if you haven't yet. Now again, I am very interested to hear your thoughts on this case. Do you think that the murderer was David or Robin? Or someone else? Please let me know in the comment section down below. Now, I'll be seeing you again real soon for another one, folks, but in the meantime, please remember to look after yourselves and your loved ones. Thank you, and goodbye. David Bain was eventually found guilty on all 5 charges of murder and was therefore sentenced to life in prison. Eligible for parole. Eligible for parole after 16 years.